Today we're going to compare up the Moza Air 2 versus the FeiyuTech AK2000 to decide which gimbal should you buy. Both of these gimbals look fairly similar to each other and they perform in fairly similar ways, but there are a couple of noticeable differences. First is the boxes they come in. The Moza box feels a much more premium box, it feels a much nicer box, but it's also notably heavier than the FeiyuTech's all polystyrene. It's the same story inside the boxes, both of them looking fairly similar. You have the gimbals themselves, you have foot stands, you have a battery charger, you have the plates, you have the cables, but the FeiyuTech's box is just a little bit tighter, everything's a little bit harder to get into. The Moza box, because it's got all these tapered edges, it's a bit easier to put everything in. So let's compare up the basic specs of these, but it's worth noting that this isn't really an apples to apples comparison because the Moza Air 2 is more of a heavy duty tripod, it has a heavier payload. However, the AK2000 has a bigger brother called the AK4000, which is more of a direct comparison, but I don't have the 4000, I only have the 2. But from what I can tell, the 2000 and 4000 are pretty much exactly the same, apart from the 4000's a little bit bigger. So the AK2000 weighs in at 1.2 kilos versus the 1.6 kilos, so the Moza Air 2 is about 25% heavier to carry than the AK2000, and that is something that I've noticed when I've been using these, that the Moza is just a lot heavier to hold. Incidentally, the AK4000 weighs in at 1.4 kilos, so is still lighter than the Moza Air 2 as well. However, that extra weight does have an advantage that the max payload of the Moza is 4.2 kilos versus only 2.8 of the AK2000. But the AK4000 is rated up to 4 kilos. Now the question is, do you really need a 4 kilo weight limit? Well, if you look on the back of the Moza Air 2 box, it says supported cameras Sony A9, Sony A7 III, Sony A6500, but it will also take things like the Sony SF7 and the Canon C100. To put it into context, a Canon 5D Mark IV fitted with a 70 to 200mm f2.8 weighs about 2.2 kilos, so well within the limits of the AK2000. Realistically, the 4 kilo weight limit is only any use if you're going really heavy duty, and seeing as how more and more people are moving to smaller, lighter systems in the mirrorless cameras, most people will probably find the AK2000 to be sufficient. Both of these are powered by 4 removable rechargeable batteries that are stored in the grip itself, so you don't recharge the whole gimbal like some new ones are doing. You have to take the batteries out and fit them in the charger, which can be a bit of a nuisance. In terms of battery life, the AK2000 is stated to run up to 12 hours of battery life versus 16 hours on the Moza. So the Moza has better battery life, although realistically, are you going to be shooting on a gimbal for 12 hours consecutive? Now the grips on these are slightly different. The AK2000 has a rubberized cylindrical grip versus the Moza having a much more shaped grip, shall we say. It is deeper, however, so if you have quite small hands, you may find this a little bit uncomfortable to hold. It feels more like a joystick. Sorry. Both have screw ports on the back for you to mount an attachable arm to fit a monitor on, for example. Both have wheels on the side. The front controls are quite similar, but here in terms of the controls is where I prefer the FeiyuTech over the Moza. Because the FeiyuTech, along with the little joystick wheel and a couple of buttons here, has a touch screen, so you can tap on the screen to alter menus, you can swipe across the different menus, you can access most of the settings through that touchscreen. The Moza has a button in the middle to access the menu, and then you can scroll through with the wheel, and you've got the thumbstick and a couple of other function buttons as well. The worst part about the usability of the Moza for me is trying to figure out how to lock and unlock particular axes. Now to do it with the FeiyuTech is pretty straightforward because you can access it all through the touchscreen. To do it on the Moza, however, you have to remember different combinations of pushing particular buttons certain numbers of times, and it's like trying to remember the cheat codes from old PlayStation games and stuff. Unless you've got them written down, odds are you're going to forget what does what. Because when I'm using it, I can't remember which buttons does what, and I'm having to faff around with everything, and half the time I'm ending up in the wrong settings for what I need, and it's not particularly easy to change, and it just doesn't work properly for me. However, in the Air 2's defense, I did find this easier to set up and balance than the AK2000. There's not a busting lot in it. They're fairly similar in how you set up and balance the gimbals. However, I've just found that the materials that the Air 2 is made of slide that little bit easier than the AK2000. And when it comes to balancing, the Moza does have one nice little feature, which is a balance check. So you can go into one of the menus in the gimbal and it will tell you how far out of balance any particular axis is. So you can fine tune the camera a lot better. The FeiyuTech, I can't see that option anywhere in there. In terms of how good these gimbals are to use, how steady they are, they're much of a muchness these days. Gimbals are all pretty good, to be fair. Now, I did want to test out the stability of these, so I did a rather ridiculous thing and climbed up to the top of a really big hill on a very windy night to try and shoot a time-lapse. Now, it wasn't a stilled image time-lapse, it was just one continual video that I've sped up because I wanted to see how much vibration actually appeared in the video. And in fairness, you can see here, it was blowing an absolute gale. The gimbal looked like it was shaking around all over the place. But in fairness, the video actually came out pretty well. Now, my plan was to shoot that with the Moza and then do the same thing with the FeiyuTech. Unfortunately, as the Moza finished up, it started to rain and I didn't really fancy getting all of this soaked, so I decided to pack it all down. Sometimes with these gimbals, if you push it a little bit too far, the whole thing freaks out a little bit, all the arms spin around in several directions, and before you know it, the camera that was pointing away from you is pointing straight at you. The FeiyuTech, when that happens, you just double tap the trigger button on the back and it always seems to reset it facing forward, no problem. But with the Moza, it tends to just give in. It'll just freak out and then the whole thing just goes flaccid and nothing will respond. The gimbal's still on, but everything's just swinging loosely in the breeze. I don't know, maybe it was just nervous. And double tapping the trigger with that doesn't reset everything back to normal. You actually have to power the gimbal down and then bring it back to life, and then it'll reset itself. So it can be a pain in the ass. And both of these do more than just you walk around carrying the camera around. Both of these have additional features, the likes of time lapses, which can be quite good. The idea being you set the gimbal up either on the stand or onto a tripod, and then you can set up a start position and then an end position and how long you want it to take, and it will automatically motor the camera around for you. Now, to set it up on the Moza, you need to download something called the Moza Master app. Connecting the app to the gimbal is extremely easy, takes no time at all, and the interface of the app is extremely well designed. I found it extremely user-friendly and quite intuitive to use. However, trying to set up the tracking for the time lapses, I continue to run into issues. With the app, you can set up a start point, an end point, multiple points in between, so you can set up any shape of arc that you want the gimbal to achieve. You can also dictate shooting time, interval time, shutter time, and it will calculate everything for you. Now, if it's not happy with some of the settings will appear red. Once it is happy with the settings, the writing will turn black. Now, I've followed Moza's own tutorials and I've looked on the help sections and I cannot find any issues as to why it's not working, but whenever I connect the USB to the camera and the gimbal, the camera's getting power, it's showing the symbol to say that it is plugged into something, but the gimbal never picks it up. It doesn't matter how I set it up, what menu settings I change, it never seems to pick up the camera, and whenever I do a time lapse, it will run the time lapse, but it never fires the shutter at all. The AK2000, however, I found to be a lot more reliable and a lot easier to do as well, for a couple of reasons. Firstly, when you plug in the supplied shutter cable to the camera and the gimbal, it actually fires the camera when you're doing a time lapse. Secondly, unlike with the Moza where you have to create the time lapse through the app, with this and the touchscreen, you can do it with or without the app. You just go into one menu and tell it how long you want the time lapse to take. You then go into the next menu, it will ask for your start and end point. So you just turn the camera on the gimbal to point in the direction you want it to start, you press OK. You move it to point in the direction you want the time lapse to end, you press OK. And then the gimbal just takes care of the rest for you. You can do it through the app if you wish. Now, in the FeiyuTech app, I found it's not as well made and well designed as the Moza app. It doesn't have as many of the features, but it does do the basics for what you would need it to do. So, in terms of pricing for all of this, the Moza Air 2 is currently priced around about £500 UK or $549 US. The AK2000 is quite a bit cheaper, £379 UK or only $308 US. But like I said at the start, this is the baby version versus the AK4000. The AK4000 is £649 UK or $599 US, so more expensive than the Moza. But which one would I choose? This is a little bit tricky. For the feel, the build quality, the Moza feels like a better gimbal, but it's more expensive to go with it. And it's heavier. And that for me was the biggest issue I found really with both of these gimbals, but more so the Moza Air 2, was just the weight of the thing. But then in fairness, this thing is designed to be able to hold over 4 kilos of gear, and none of my gear, hell, not even all of my gear combined, weighs 4 kilos. So if you're looking for a gimbal for heavy duty workloads, you're looking Moza Air 2 versus the AK4000. And considering the AK4000 is more expensive than the Air 2, I would be inclined to go with the Moza. For lighter gear, however, the AK2000 does pretty much everything that the Moza does. Granted, in some respects, maybe not as well, but I found it more reliable. It doesn't need a degree in rocket science to work out why the camera doesn't communicate with it. With the FeiyuTech, I didn't even need to look at tutorials or instructions. It was pretty straightforward. Just cable into camera, into gimbal, and it just works. But obviously, nobody cares about my opinion. Everyone wants to know which Rusty would pick. Rusty, which one would you choose? Come on, which one? Do you want that one or that one? Which one? Oh! So there we are. It's unanimous. Both me and Rusty would choose the AK2000 over the Moza. But which one would you pick? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully we'll see you in the next video. Where is